Okay, we will move over now to Anna Cates. She is a soil specialist and state soil health for Minnesota. I'll pass it over to you, Anna.
Hi there. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Good. All right. This isn't exactly the title I think I have on the agenda, but I think you get the idea. I think my title was How Practices like Reduced Tillage and Cover Crops Affect Soil Water in Minnesota. And that's a little bit shortened here, truncated. I really enjoyed the last presentation. I learned a lot about a topic I rarely think about, and this is going to be a big switch to thinking more about what's going on in your soil. I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure of your soil and how it is built, and then talk about some of our data actually looking at soil water changes. We've had some dry years the last few years. I heard the last fellow say, "Oh, we haven't had any droughts or anything," but we certainly have in a lot of Minnesota. So that has affected some of our how we framed our research. So, just a little bit more about me. I've been at the University of Minnesota for 5 years in my role as state soil health specialist. I work for something called the Minnesota Office for Soil Health. We do training, research, and networking. I work a lot with the conservation professionals, which in our state are county-based people who run cost share programs and technical assistance for farmers. We try to just integrate soil health into any ag advisor's toolkit, whether they're commercial or government, so that the person the farmer already trusts can help if they want to try a new practice. So, I want to talk about what happens with cover crops and water first. This gets into the meat and potatoes of what soil health might be in your system. I haven't even introduced the soil health principles, so excuse me if I'm jumping right into the middle of it. But the primary principles are to reduce disturbance and increase the amount of time you have a living root in the ground. And cover crops are the primary way to do that in the row crop systems we run in the upper Midwest with a lot of corn and soybean annual, warm season crops. So you need a cool season crop growing over the winter or at least into the fall. I'm going to talk about how a cover crop over the course of its lifespan affects your soil water, show some data about that, et cetera. But this first part is just looking at the cover crop over the course of a year. So we'll look at a overwintering crop like cereal rye pictured here. Planted in the fall, it's going to, essentially reduce the amount of water available. That's what this downward arrow is about, and that's through the basic mechanism of just plant water uptake. However, if this is in a reduced tillage system and you're comparing that, the baseline comparison is to a full width tillage system with no cover crop, you might actually have a little bit of an effect in the opposite direction, where a fully tilled system is going to have a lot of evaporation, and the cover crop water uptake, depending on temperature conditions, may or may not compete with that. So that's your fall effect after you've planted the cover crop. We consider this a great fall cover crop in Minnesota. Sometimes we get much less growth in our falls. This year it's been pretty open and a little warmer, so things are looking nice. To get into winter, cover crops are covered by snow. Sometimes they catch a little snow. Again, that depends on what your baseline is. If you're looking at a really chunky moldboard plow situation, you're catching a lot of snow there too. If you're comparing it with a real smooth tilled field, then you're probably catching more snow with the cover crop. If you catch more snow, then you have warmer soil and more infiltration. So that can be maybe a little increase in how much water your profile captures over the course of the winter. Just depends a lot on the climatic variability of the winter. Get into the spring, this is where we really see our cover crops take off. And as the more they grow, the more water they're taking up. So you're having basically a straight effect of plant water uptake, diminishing soil water for cover crops in the spring. So you've got kind of, an up, down, up, down, up, down. And after this, pretty much our cover crops are killed, right? So we no longer have the effect of the living cover crop. Instead, the next part is the long-term effect of having that cover crop in your system. So in the summer, right afterward, this is a picture of soybeans growing through a fairly heavy cover crop, especially for us. Presumably, we've terminated our cover crop sometime around cash crop planting, and what's left is this residue. I'm sure some of you see this and shudder at the amount of residue, and you're not alone among the farmers that I work with. So the residue, though, is going to reduce evaporation. It should also build soil structure through some mechanisms I'm going to talk about. and increase infiltration and storage. So overall, the longer term effect of your cover crop after it's been killed is that you're going to increase soil water in the system. And if you were to add up all of these arrows, you should probably get overall a decrease in your soil water supply. The amount of that decrease, I have it presented as a range, if you can imagine a range of arrow sizes, is going to just depend on the growth of the cover crop essentially and the rest of the conditions. So cover crops are dragging water down when they grow and probably increasing water retention during the summer. So now I want to talk a lot about this sort of systemic long-term changes that we have in the soil as a result of growing cover crops over the winter. So talk more about this soil stuff. I am a soil scientist by training, and most of my research has to do with measuring soil properties. So I'm going to get all the way into the nitty-gritty. So what's happening when the cover crop is growing? This is just a short video that shows the roots actually growing in the system. I don't think we need to hear the sound, but I want you to notice how the roots are exploring the soil slowly. So these living plants, as they move through the physical soil, they're changing the soil structure as they go, and they're changing the soil biology as they go. The living root pushes a hole in the soil, and that hole stays where it was pushed. Let's see. I don't need to see any more of this YouTube video. This is a close-up on what's happening right on that root surface. So the root exudates, this is the extra carbon or sugars that come out of the root as the plant is photosynthesizing, feed microbial life. The plant is building its leaves and roots and other biomass, and as it does, it actually has enough carbon generated from photosynthesis to just slough off extra sugars and organic acids through its roots. So this means that microbes like to live right next to the plant roots. And as they're eating this plant carbon, they're also mineralizing other available nutrients. So that's why you have a lot of nutrient exchange right at the root. This picture shows bacterial cells as just little tiny balls essentially there, and then it shows the fungal hyphae, which might be a little bit more interactive with the root in the case of mycorrhizal fungi. So as they're living on the roots, you kind of get this effect of building soil structure. The biology is supported by that photosynthetic excess that the plants are shooting out. That's a sort of nutrient exchange element. But the other element is the physical change in the soil. So here's the macro view of this. If you pull some plant roots out, you get that sort of dreadlocks, one of my colleagues sometimes calls it, where you actually have the soil clinging to the roots. And those are little tiny aggregates. This is the micro view of it that shows little tiny microbial cells sticking to the edge of minerals in the soil. So as you build up these tiny interactions, you get these larger soil aggregates. So here's one more short video, which shouldn't offer any audio interruptions. This is made of a bunch of X-ray scans by Dr. Devin Ripner, who I got this video off of Twitter, and it's just been so fun to be able to actually see inside of an aggregate, which otherwise is a real black box for us as scientists. In this case, the gray is the minerals, the tan you can see now is the organic matter, and then the blue is the pore space. So the aggregate is held together by that sticky organic material that I showed you in the last slide. Or if you look at the little bit of organic matter, the big chunk in the middle of this aggregate, sometimes I think of that as like a rock in the middle of a snowball. It can kind of just be tucked away inside and protected. Uh, the aggregates can come in different sizes. You can see the scale bar here is 100 micrometer, so a tenth of a millimeter, very, very small. But as you get these small aggregates, they build up into larger aggregates. As you get larger aggregates, then not only are those glues important, then you have the binding action of roots and fungal hyphae. So glue for the small scale aggregates, and then roots and hyphae, the stringy stuff at the larger scale. So all of your roots are doing this. There's nothing magical about cover crop roots that does this better than other crops. Your corn roots are building soil structure in this way, your soybean roots, your canola roots, what have you. The point is that the more of your soil interacts with the root, the more structure you're going to have. And the less disturbance you have in your system to break up, especially these stringy roots and hyphae, the better that structure is going to stick around. Okay, why do we care about having this structure and having aggregates in the soil? That we're getting back to water now. So this is a little image that shows the soil from two different views. If you look at the top two circles, it's as though you're looking down on the surface of the soil. The one on the left is a poorly structured, really smooth soil system. The one on the right is a well-structured system with kind of more different sizes of particles. The second element of the image is a cutaway. So here's the surface of the soil, and the blue lines represent water going into it. As you try to get water entering over here, you don't have very big spaces for the water to pass through. As you try to get water entering over here, you have more large spaces for the water to pass through. So it's, this is the basic difference between infiltration in a sandy or a finer textured soil, which I'm sure you're pretty much all familiar with. A clay soil, you have this phenomena where the water just can't get in very fast because there aren't those highways, those big pores to zoom water straight down the profile. And in a sandy soil, you've got a lot of big pores. You can get that water in easily. But this is different than just texture of clay versus sand in your soil. The aggregates, the structure on top of your texture, actually allows you to store water inside these particles. So when you think about what we want our soil to do in relation to water, we actually want these two completely different functions. We want to let the water in, and we want to hold the water for the long term. And like I said, clay can't let the water in very well, and sand can't store the water very well. So we need to build structure on the next level of size and using the power of biology in terms of those microbial residues and the roots and hyphae. And you need to use both of those elements to build the aggregates that give you both of those functions at the same time. Otherwise, you're going to be, and to be fair, aggregates aren't going to be the cure-all for your soil texture. A clay soil is still going to have slower infiltration than a sandier soil. A sandier soil is going to have a harder time building aggregates because clay particles are more reactive for microbes, hold more organic matter on them. So they tend to build stickier aggregates more easily. But both can go a little bit more towards the middle if you build that aggregate structure. So here's another image of that, another X-ray of soil in South Dakota that illustrates the sort of long pores, big pores I'm talking about that you get between aggregates. Here what they did was they took two different depths, the 10 centimeter and 20 centimeter depth of a conventional system, a long-term no-till system, and a short-term no-till system. In the X-ray, the smaller pores are green and the larger pores are red. And you can see in the conventional system, you have a lot of pore space here. I don't know exactly how long after tillage these x-rays were taken. That probably has an effect, but I'm guessing by the amount of pores that it was fairly recently after tillage with not a lot of rains to sort of repack the soil. You have a lot of nice fluffy soil. This is why we till in a seed bed frequently, is because we like to see that fluffy, well aerated soil, because this does have some water holding capacity. What it doesn't have is that ability to transfer water down. And in the no-till system, my gosh, you can just so clearly see those slides. It's like a chutes and ladders game or something where you can just see the tubes pulling the water down into the deeper depths, especially in this long-term system. I think it's neat how in this short-term no-till system, just 4 years old, you have a few of those, but you don't have it to the extent that you do over here. And especially as you get deeper, the short-term no-till still looks like a conventional system. And so people in our part of the world really recommend pairing a transition to no-till with cover crops because they will help punch those roots through, as we saw in the video where you could see the roots going down. They will punch through and create those long pores, and they'll stick around for roots in the future to use again. These are probably old root channels that we're seeing here, or possibly earthworm channels as well. Okay, one more set of videos that illustrates the difference in how these soils from a tilled versus a less tilled system might behave when water is applied. So here we use this device called a Cornell sprinkle infiltrometer that essentially rests on a cylinder in the soil and delivers a certain amount of rain over a certain period of time. On the left, we delivered that rain, which wasn't a huge amount. Maybe we rained for 45 minutes. This was just part of a training exercise in my lab, but the images were so good, I've kept them. Um, so on the left, we have a system with tillage, and there's a little bit of phacelia, a kind of unusual cover crop there, but this is a heavily tilled field that hasn't had much growing in it for the better part of a year. And over here, we're in high summer, and we've had a rye cover crop that has essentially been allowed to go all the way to seed. And so after the water fell here, it still looks like well-structured soil. You can imagine that in the next rain, it'll still be able to bring some water down through these larger cracks that you can see. There's some intact roots holding soil structure together. And over here, things have really dissolved and turned to jello. So a lot of some of the research I'm going to show next is really inspired by seeing things like this in the field and trying to put some numbers behind them. What happens when it rains on systems like this? What properties is this in the soil that allows us to, or that looks so different than the soil health system? Okay, so just to summarize the effects of cover crops before I get a little bit more into the moisture, we see that overall in the water balance, they probably reduce the soil at those wet times of year, fall and spring, and then they should increase the moisture at the dry times of year when there's enough um, structure built by them. They're definitely feeding the microbes and building soil structure while they're growing. And then really importantly, they're reducing erosion. We've done some work with these little mats that you pin on the surface to see water erosion going across the field in runoff. And so we pin these mats to the ground and we come back a month later and see how much sediment has come on top of them. So it's an estimate. It's not going to go into any erosion runoff models, but it's effective in showing the effects of cover crops. So when we have no cover systems, we have a lot more sediment flowing onto those mats than we do when we have a cover crop at 60 pounds an acre in this case. These are two southern Minnesota sites. This is the amount of nutrients that are in that sediment. We weren't able to measure things separately for each treatment because it's overall a really small amount of sediment you collect on these mats. But we were able to show that there's pretty high concentrations of nitrate, good amounts of phosphorus and potassium in the sediment that's flowing off. Remember that the stuff that's likely to flow is probably your fine particles. And again, those fine particles hold organic matter and nutrients on them. So stuff that moves tends to carry nutrients with it. All right, so I've been talking as though drawing down water in these fall and spring times is always a good thing, but I want to show you some exceptions to that. Um, so if we go back to this, that's we've had a couple of very wet springs in Minnesota where cover crops were able to grow a lot and effectively take up a lot of water. And I want to show you the effects of that because that's not always wonderful. Here is a figure from South Dakota that talks about the cover crop effect on corn grain yield. And there's a few different elements of this. The first is the y-axis is the yield difference. So this was done on farms across South Dakota where they have different amounts of precipitation. That's your x-axis. Here is the different amounts of precipitation at each site. And then at each pair, they calculated the difference between a cover crop field and a non-cover crop field. So I believe this is the cover crop treatment minus the control with no cover crop. So anything below the line means that the cover crop treatment yielded less than the control treatment. Anything above the line means that the cover crop treatment yielded more than the no cover crop treatment. And so what this figure, which my friend David Karki presented, and I've really appreciated, what this figure highlights is that where we have a significant cover crop yield change, in this case it says advantage, but really all of the ones that are significant show yield hits. Where we have significant cover crop yield hits are in this range of less than around 510, 520 millimeters of precipitation. Where we have more than that, really, it's never significant, the difference between a cover crop and a non-cover crop field. The dots are not always above the line, I'll give you that, but there's no statistically significant change. Over here, we still have some where it's above the line, but all of our significant effects are negative, and they're all where we have less precipitation. So you might be thinking, okay, where am I on this precipitation map? And I brought up this map of Canadian precipitation, so you can kind of pick yourself out. Again, it's that about 550 millimeter where we saw our real ledge, which is right about in this medium tone of blue. So I think here, a lot of this area would be in that medium area, whereas down here in Ontario, maybe not as much of an issue, but out on the prairies, certainly we are marginal in terms of our ability to grow cover crop without having to pay attention to how much water it's taking up and make sure that you're leaving some there for your cash crop. So in David Karki's study, this was all on corn, just to refresh your memory. We've been doing a study where we looked at the effect of different cover crop termination timings on soybean in western Minnesota. And in our case, in David's case, they saw no yield hit with soybean. Soybean was really resilient to different precip conditions and the cover crop were not. In our case, we actually did see a yield hit with soybean. And I think you'll see why, because we had so much cover crop growth in our plots in the last couple of years. So it was very wet in the spring. It was hard to get out and terminate in time. We planted rye at 55 to 60 pounds an acre. I'm sorry, my conversion to kilograms per hectare is not at the tip of my tongue. But this is a fairly heavy rate of rye. So that was in September after a corn silage harvest, and the soybeans weren't seeded until June 8th. So seeding was really delayed for soybeans, and that also delayed termination. So these termination timings are, no soybeans at all. I'm sorry, no cover crops at all. Termination of cover crops 22 days before planting, termination 1 day after planting, and termination 9 days after planting. So this was looking at the practice of planting green, and we found that if your cover crop took up too much moisture and got too big, it really was not a good practice. There was not a lot of opportunity to get in there and terminate. We were really struggling, but certainly these ones where we were able to get in there 3 weeks beforehand had the best yield in this case. Okay, so that covers, do we actually always want this water drawdown in the fall and spring? And then the next thing I want to talk about is, do we actually see this effect of increasing soil water, especially in these drought years? In those soybean plots I showed you, it wasn't enough to make up the yield of those soybeans. But we do have some data showing how the soil moisture responded over the course of some dry years. So this is my master's student, Bailey Tangen, who did some great work at 3 different on-farm pairs over 2021 and 2022. So these are all in southern Minnesota. You can see they have different rotations, different tillage regimes. This is not a specific comparison of two tillage regimes or cover crop versus not cover crop anymore. In this case, I'm trying to look at full application of soil health principles. So reducing disturbance, getting some diversity in the system. And we have some really long-term practitioners of these systems in our study. This is what the precip looked like. I'm sorry, again, we're in inches. So let's see, here's about 250 millimeters and about 510. We had a few rains, a lot of them kind of concentrated at that end of the year. All right, this is soil moisture in the top 10 centimeter. The way these figures look, and I apologize, it's going to switch in a couple slides, but for the way these figures look, I've got the 3 different colors representing 3 different sites, and then the lines represent the 2 treatments, conventional versus soil health. You can see over the course of time in 2021 and 2022, what you want to do is kind of compare the 2 different kinds of lines of the same color. So, okay, here we've got more moisture in the soil health system at Blooming Prairie. That's our long-term no-till site. At our other sites, the 2 different kinds of lines are very similar. And then over here, it turns out it's Dundas that shows a little more difference between treatments, whereas the other 2 sites are the same. So I kind of uh, treat this as a wash. I should point out that the axis here is volumetric water content as a proportion. So if you've ever taken an intro soils class, you might have seen a pie chart like that, where they talk about how the volume of soil is half solid and half space. And so when I say that the volumetric water content is, in this case, about 0.2 to 0.25, that means that about 25% of the total volume of the soil is water, meaning that about 25% or a quarter of the pores are air filled. So that's how that volumetric water content metric looks. And this is like a fine normal range of volumetric water content for your surface soil because of the effects of evaporation and crop uptake. You wouldn't expect it to get much more saturated than that. Saturated again would look more like 50% if you think about this pie chart. So now we're looking all the way down at 40 centimeters, and here we're seeing a little bit more difference between the treatments at the sites, especially in 2021. That treatment effect doesn't really persist in 2022. I think we were just much drier overall in 2022. You can see we started the year with less water in the profile in most sites, so we didn't get as much recharge over the winter as we would have liked. So we see some evidence that the soil health system can hold on to more water deeper in the profile due to those properties I talked about. But when the system is super dry, it's just not going to be possible no matter what your farming practices are, or it's going to be less possible no matter what your farming practices are. So this study, though, was actually motivated by wet years. We ended up collecting this data in dry years, but I was really trying in this study to understand how the soil responds to rain in order to better understand whether there's an opportunity for farmers to get into the field faster after a rainfall in a soil health system. This is something I have heard many anecdotes about at different events that I like to go to. Farmers talking about their soil health system and why they like it often talk about that they feel like they have more flexibility relative to the weather. They say it just dries out faster. They say my neighbor was sinking and getting stuck, and I floated right over the top. So I specifically was looking at soil moisture and soil structure because I thought the two reasons why that could be happening would be either that the soil just dried out faster, so you didn't have as much moisture to contend with, or it had better structure. So even though it was wet, if you can imagine that video with my finger poking the two different kinds of structure, they got the same amount of water, but one was able to, the structure was able to withstand that soaking rain. So before I just showed you, the volumetric water content over the season with a bunch of data points, now I'm going to explain those data points relative to when we got rain. So my student, my goodness, she was really dedicated and wonderful. She was watching the weather like a hawk. Every time we had around an inch of rain in the forecast, again about 2.5 centimeters, half an inch, we'd go down to about a centimeter. So she'd try to get out there 24 hours before the rain was forecast. Hopefully it rained. Didn't always. If it did, then we'd go back out 24 hours after, and then she'd go back out 3 days afterward. Every time she went out, she took one of these moisture measurements. This is what the probe looked like with those sensors at various depths. I showed you from the 10 centimeter depth and the 40 centimeter depth last time. And then she also took a shovel sample to measure soil aggregates. So the property we were trying to understand is the difference in water between this sample and this sample. Was water captured in that amount of time? We also looked at the difference between 24 hours before and 3 to 4 days after, but I'm going to focus on the change 24 hours after the rain here because the data was fairly similar and it makes it easier to follow the story. So what I'm going to be showing you in the next slide is the difference between these two metrics in moisture, and then we'll move into soil aggregates. Okay, so here what I'm showing is the three different sites. I warned you that my color scheme was going to change as my student made these figures. So I've got my three different sites, Blooming Prairie, Cannon City, and Dundas. The two colors represent the two different treatments, with green being soil health and orange being conventional. The x-axis is the pre-rain volumetric water content. So how much water was in the soil at 10 centimeters before the rain? Before we looked at how the volumetric water content at 10 centimeters kind of ranged between, I don't know, 0.15 and 0.3. And you can see that range here on this axis, right? So each one of these dots represents a rain event. And before the rain event, you can see it at this particular site and this time, the pre-rain volumetric water content was 15%. So pretty dry, I would say. And then the y-axis is the change. So if it's above the zero line, that means that you captured water after that rain, that it was actually more moist after that rain. You can see most of the dots sensibly are above that. Some of these rains might have been fairly small. Some of them you might just have kind of fluke field conditions, maybe cracks in the soil that would cause you to get lower values after the rain versus before the rain. That happens sometimes. We've kept that noise in the data for now, but most of the data fits where you'd expect it to above the line. So the lines represent that relationship between the pre-rain conditions and the ability of the soil to capture water. And overall, we see that as you get wetter conditions before the rain, so further on the right hand of each of these figures, you get less water capture. You tend to be more around zero. But you can see that is different by site and different by treatment. So here at Cannon City and Dundas, these green lines, the soil health lines, are almost flat, meaning that they're able to capture similar amounts of water in the soil when they start quite dry here at less than 10% water, as well as up here at 20% water. So they're able to capture a good amount of water, even if they start a little bit wetter. So the change in volumetric water content, is about 5% on average here, whereas in some of the conventional sites, you get quite a bit lower. You can see the slope of this line is probably the steepest over here at the Blooming Prairie site, where you can really see like as it gets wetter, you get less rain capture. So when you have drier conditions, you capture more rain. That makes sense, but soil health systems did better when you were a little bit wetter. They were still able to capture rain even when they were wet. Now we're going to look at similar data for the aggregates. So I'm sorry this animation isn't perfect, but let me see what I want. There we go. We'll just go to the figure. In this case, we're in that same green and yellow color scheme for the two treatments. We have 2021 and 2022 are two study years in the two columns, and then the three sites as the three rows of data. And this axis is the percent of soil sample in large aggregates. So we took the soil back to the lab. We used a wet sieving apparatus to separate aggregates of different sizes. And we found that in a lot of these sites, we had about, 25 to 50%, or pretty low in Blooming Prairie in some cases. But say around 50% of the soil was the largest aggregate classes, and then the rest of the soil was smaller aggregates or unaggregated particles. And the main point of these figures is that just that across the season, both years, the soil health system had more large aggregates. So that's the baseline conditions. We had more large aggregates in these soil health systems. Now we'll look at those relative to rain. So again, we'll be looking at the response variable of the difference from pre-rain aggregates and post-rain aggregates. Do we see them dissolve into soup, or do we see them maintain a robust size? So this is the same kind of figure I showed you a little bit ago. Again, the x-axis here is the pre-rain macro aggregates, and this is the same data that we saw in the previous slide. Each one of these is a rain event where before the rain event, say this, soil health site started at around, 75% macro aggregates. And over here, like before the rain, they started at about 25% macro aggregates. And then the y-axis is the change. So above the zero means an increase in aggregates, and below the line means a decrease in aggregates. So I noticed that most of the dots are below the line in all cases. Rain at the surface tends to be fairly destructive towards those aggregates. They tend to disintegrate a little bit. So you see some of that phenomena no matter what. But essentially, the conventional systems, they lost similar amounts of aggregates, but they started lower. And so when they lost aggregates, they ended up lower also. So as we showed in the last slide, throughout the season, the soil health system had more aggregates. And even when they got disintegrated in a rain, they were able to kind of bounce back. Okay. So I have a couple little summary statements here to kind of put a bow on what I've talked about on how our soil health systems change our soil water. Essentially, with cover crops, you have this push-pull. There's this short-term water use from cover crops that can cause a cash crop deficit, but you have this ability of those systems to retain more water due to better structure, and you also have their ability, and that means retaining some nutrients and reducing erosion. So when you have the cover crops in the system, our recommendations based on these dry years are to terminate as early as you can. We didn't probably need our research plots to show us that, but our research plots are a really stark illustration of the need to terminate early when you're getting dry. Of course, there's no way to know when you're getting dry. So this maybe just these last couple of years, I think people are going to be being a little bit more conservative on their termination practices. The other thing on the response to rain is that we were able to show that soil health systems capture a little more rain, and that aggregates in these systems can hold together a little bit more when they're wetted. I don't think I actually zoomed in on this, but if you look at like here in Cannon City, where both systems start, say around this 50% aggregated line, a lot of the soil health dots are above the line, meaning that they got stronger, they increased after a rain. And a lot of these conventional dots are below the line. So even though they're both starting at about 50% aggregates, we're able to see that the aggregates and the soil health systems respond a little bit differently. Here, there's not a lot of overlap because the aggregation is so different at Blooming Prairie, but at Dundas, you can kind of see that same situation as well, but the effect isn't as strong in Dundas. I think because Dundas is the shortest amount of time and the least intensive use of soil health practices in this set of 3 sites. So at the other sites, we have much longer term reduced or no-till systems. Really, we have consistent use of a third crop in Blooming Prairie. And then in Dundas, we have just less. They're still doing some vertical tillage. They're kind of playing with a few different practices, including some cover crops, and the soil's doing great, but it just probably hasn't completely uh, changed its properties as much as these two systems, which are a really stark contrast. Okay, so just to complete that summary thought, the soil health systems were able to capture a little more rain, and the aggregates in those systems were able to hold together and occasionally get a little stronger when wetted. So I'm going to wrap up there. I'm going to mute my microphone to cough and then look at the chat for questions.
Hi there. Thank you so much, Anna. And I think we have time for questions. We absolutely have time for questions. And does anyone have any that they would like to ask themselves? Or if you want to type it in the chat, feel free to do that.
I'll jump in. Oh, go ahead.
No, I put some comments in the chat, so I'll just.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've heard those observations also, the best moisture infiltration, less runoff, and better trafficability in the lower slope depressions compared to conventional tillage. That's what I hear too. I have one colleague who he says the best way to observe your soil health is to go out there in the middle of a rainstorm where you can see whether the water is infiltrating or running off and really get a sense of, whether you're getting to that jello texture or keeping your soil intact.
Hi, Anna. Ken Coles here. Really appreciated your presentation. Did a wonderful job. I love the research. We are also engaged in research here at Farming Smarter, and there's been federal policies sort of promoting the use of cover crops, and I think where we've sort of failed is that distinction between rainfall areas, because we have seen a lot of damage to our main crops here. What's been incredibly striking to me as well is that we're still seeing that reduction in yield even with irrigation. So
Wow.
I'm wondering if it's just that moisture at time of germination that's very important, where we're not getting the crops established and off to the races. I'm just wondering if you've seen anything similar to that.
What crops are you talking about? Any crop, all crops?
Um, Pretty much all crops that we were playing with this year, but particularly canola and wheat and even corn.
Okay. I don't work with canola and wheat enough to say anything specific about them, but I saw a really great presentation by Allison Robertson, who's a pathologist at Iowa State recently, who has done a lot of work investigating the potential for transfer of seedling disease from rye to corn. And it is significant when you have rye followed by corn. I know others have talked about this green bridge issue, but if you look up Allison Robertson, she has just a really nice set of experiments. But what we talked about, she and I, is that it's this combination of factors. The moisture might be the factor, the seedling disease might be the factor. Taking up nitrogen and not releasing it right at the time that your cash crop needs it might be a factor. And the allelopathy, if you're using rye, might also be a factor. It's really hard to disentangle all of those. She found that she was able to reduce the seedling disease either by terminating earlier before her corn crop or by spatially separating the cover crop and the corn crop. So she would plant her cover crop in 15-inch rows between her cash crop. So that was, I thought, a neat workaround and kind of points to the ways that we can mitigate that. We have a big push for cover crops in our state too, and I think that the ongoing tension is to what extent is it the taxpayer's responsibility to subsidize a practice that might be risky for farmers, or are we going to get to a point where it is not riskier, any more than choosing a hybrid, that kind of thing?
Okay, there's a couple questions in the chat here, and if anybody else would like to, just raise your hand and then I can call on you. Is there a cover crop that you've seen work best for root development?
Sure. I kind of go by the more roots the better philosophy. So usually grasses are better because they have more capacity to grow in our cool falls. If you have a system where you can get in a little earlier after silage, or we have some canning crops, or after a small grain, then you could maybe get something else like a brassica and a legume to take off. We just don't see that much where I am, and I'm guessing for a lot of you that's the case also. So anything that grows is going to be the best for your root development, and just hitting that baseline is great. The grasses also are great because they have the fibrous root system, right? That's what built our prairie soils. Builds every little millimeter of soil that you touch with a root is affecting the biology and the structure there. So the more exploration you have, the better.
Okay, we'll move over to Scott. Go ahead, Scott. You can unmute yourself, ask your question.
It was more of a comment, or just wondering if you'd heard of some of the other stuff, or some other research that I came across. It was about it was a paper that came out that talked about the 27-inch rule for cover crops. Was there kind of cutoff, or was there kind of they did a meta-analysis? So I found this out from a blog post, and I can put it in the chat. But it
In
kind
terms of
of
height?
no precipitation, that
Oh, sure.
when they did a meta-analysis, or like of all kinds of cover crop studies, they found that
Mhm.
that the places where it would start to pay was once you had over 27 inches. So whether you've heard
Yeah.
that or not, or seen that, or
I don't have that particular threshold in my head, but it makes sense. The research I showed from South Dakota is just one study in one area, and that threshold fits at around 22 inches. It would make sense to me if it was a little bit higher than that, because in Minnesota, we're generally a little higher than that, but I think we still, as I showed, sometimes get into trouble. And then, of course, the timing of the precipitation is really important. Also, I didn't talk about that, I didn't give numbers about that, but I talked about how we've had these wet springs and dry summers, and maybe some of you have seen similar stuff. So 27 seems to me like a reasonable threshold. But again, it's going to depend on your soils and year and all that stuff. And I haven't heard of anybody having this issue where they also have irrigation, but that sounds pretty dire, and hopefully is due to
well,
other factors.
well, and actually just on that point. So in the past 3 years, I was looking it up. We're at about, I think it was 22 inches, or 22 inches, or 25 inches, kind of depending on the area, is our total for the last 3 years.
Whoa, okay.
And so on irrigation, even on, say, on a normal rainfall year, maybe if you apply 15 inches and then you get another 10 or 12 inches, you're still
right there.
low. So that's why, yeah, it's been one of those things. Yeah, it's even on irrigation, it's been tough to make these work. So
Yeah, and I can see how at that low of a rainfall, it's hard to build up enough years of cover cropping and enough residue on the surface that you get the benefits in terms of increased, or yeah, less evapotranspiration at the surface, because that I think can be a big factor too.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Good point.
Okay. If anyone else has a question, feel free to raise your hand as well. We have one more in the chat from John. Does strip till, have you seen any similar results or done any research comparing strip till to no till?
I haven't looked at just the spectrum of tillage systems myself, John. I can put the link in the chat when I'm done talking, that we have this Upper Midwest tillage guide that Jody DeYoung Hughes has put together, and that has real specific comparisons between strip till, no till, and conventional tillage. Strip till often ends up being the economical choice in terms of cost of production here, because you have those reduced diesel and sometimes input costs with a strip till system, but you still have really comparable yields overall. In terms of the water budget, just super complicated to figure out. One of my sites that I presented on, the Cannon City site, did use strip till exclusively, and they still saw some of those effects of increased moisture down the profile. So I think that strip till can give you a lot of these benefits, but there's going to be a lot of variety in terms of whether you have, long-term strips established, or if you bounce around from place to place, or if you've got the cover crop growing, or just residue between your strips. So the variability in different tillage systems is really important for understanding the differences in moisture retention and moisture capture, but it's really different.
Okay, we will have another one from John. Any work being done on delayed germination cover crops to allow seeding cover crops in spring to start covers before harvest in dry north prairies?
I'm not sure I totally understand this. Seeding cover crops in spring, does that mean interseeding in your cash crop, are you thinking? Or are you think? Go ahead.
Yes. So yes, our biggest problem in northern prairies is we don't have time between harvest and first frosts
Yeah.
to get a cover crop established. So somehow you have to get it started sometime in August, when
Yeah.
often we're not getting moisture. So if you could seed at the time, but it's got a coating or something that you could, if we could get our cover crops started, early August, then on dry land, and maybe even some irrigation like corn, it would give us some green growth.
Yeah. Well, I'm not in the dry North Prairie, so I don't have any work specific in that system. But where I work in the upper Midwest, the most common interseeding options are for very early in the corn growing season. People like to get it established just before a corn canopy cover, and this seems to work best in silage, where you just have a couple more weeks of core of empty space at the end of the season, and then if you can take it for forage, then it really pays off. So. But in terms of just getting the cover crop to establish and survive, people like around the V4 stage of corn, where it has a little time on the sun before the corn canopy covers. The other time I've heard being very successful, I don't have any specific research on this, but the other time I've heard being very successful is right before leaf drop in soybeans, where you just get a couple more weeks of the seed sitting there. All of these interseeding things are all of them are dependent on rainfall. I was going to say because they're mostly broadcast. A lot of them are broadcast, but sometimes when people are interseeding, they do have a drill that functions between the corn rows. So that varies a little bit. I see another question. Seeding a cover crop into the cash crop via a drone in August. We did do that in some of our research plots. It worked fine. Aerial seeding again, the name of the game is moisture. With a drone, though, maybe you can be a little bit more responsive and agile because it's smaller and more people have them and what have you than an airplane. But uh, again, if you don't get moisture after you do it, then nothing happens. So you've got to get the moisture to work the seed in after any kind of aerial application, and that's just been a crapshoot, as I'm sure you've experienced.
Okay, any final questions for Anna? Going once, going twice. Perfect. Okay, thanks so much, Anna, for being flexible, and apologies for being sort of off schedule a little bit here this morning, but appreciate your time and your knowledge.
Sure.
Very much appreciated your presentation, and look forward to perhaps having you here at Farming Smarter in person one of these days.
Yeah, that would be fun. I feel like Johan is the one we need to apologize to and thank for being so flexible. I got to stick basically to my presentation slot, so thank you, Johan.
Oh, don't ever apologize to him.
Be nice.
He's resilient.
That's fine.
I was hoping for a Minnesotan accent, though. I take it you're not from there.
Yeah, you probably can't quite tell. I've got a Montana map behind me. That's where I
There
mostly
we
grew
go.
up. Yeah, so
Nice.
I know a little bit of the dry North Prairies.
Okay, so I had thrown the QR codes up for the last two presentations. Hopefully you were able to scan those. And I just wanted to thank some of our program partners for 2023 at Farming Smarter. We are a nonprofit and we do rely on generous donations and support from all kinds of different people, including BDO and RBC, as well as our title sponsor for this event, which is FMC. I hope that everyone has an opportunity here in the next couple of minutes. Maybe we'll just take a 5-minute break, if that's okay with you, Johan, and we'll just encourage everyone to grab their lunch or a snack, and then we'll get into the presentation conversation with Ken and Johan.